What would you do if a charming young man claimed to be your long-lost nephew and showed up with legal papers to prove it? Would you welcome him with open arms? Would you check his story? Would you change your will to include him? Well, when I discovered his real identity, I gave him exactly the inheritance he deserved. My name is Betty Whitmore, and I'm 81 years old now. Everyone in Riverside knows me as the eccentric old woman who lives alone in the big Victorian house on Maple Street, the one with too many cats and an overgrown garden that drives the neighbors to distraction. They whisper about how I should be in a nursing home, how it's dangerous for someone my age to live independently, how sad it is that I have no family to look after me. What they don't know is that I've been perfectly capable of looking after myself for the past 15 years since my husband Harold passed. And what they especially don't know is that 2 years ago, I encountered evil so cleverly disguised as family love that it nearly cost me everything I'd spent 80 years building. The story begins on a rainy Thursday in October, when someone knocked on my front door with the kind of confident persistence that suggested they weren't going away easily. I wasn't expecting visitors. At my age, most of the people I used to know are either dead or in facilities that don't allow them to go calling on old friends. When I opened the door, I found myself looking at one of the most handsome young men I'd ever seen. He was maybe 35, with dark hair, warm brown eyes, and the kind of smile that made you trust him immediately. He was well dressed without being flashy, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive but not ostentatious, and he had this air of respectful confidence that reminded me of Harold in his younger days.
"Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and his voice was warm honey over fresh biscuits. "My name is David Marshall. I believe we're family."
Family. The word hit me like a physical blow because it was the one thing I'd been missing most since Harold died. We'd never had children. Not for lack of trying, but sometimes life doesn't give you what you want most. Harold's brother had died young, and my sister had moved to Australia in the 1960s and lost touch completely. As far as I knew, I was the last of my line, alone in a world that seemed designed for people with children and grandchildren. David explained that he was the grandson of my late brother-in-law, Thomas, Harold's younger brother who died in Vietnam. According to his story, Thomas had fathered a son before shipping out, a boy who'd been raised by his mother's family and never knew his father's side of the family existed until recently. "I've been searching for my father's family for years," David told me as I invited him in for coffee, my hands trembling slightly with excitement. "When I finally tracked down the military records and found out about Uncle Harold, I hoped against hope that he might still be alive. When I learned he'd passed but that you were still here, well, I had to come meet my aunt." Aunt? I'd never been anyone's aunt. Never had that special relationship with a child who wasn't quite my own but loved me anyway. The word wrapped around my heart like a warm blanket, filling a void I'd carried for decades. David had brought photographs, documents, even a few personal effects that had supposedly belonged to Thomas. A watch that looked remarkably similar to one Harold used to wear. Letters written in a handwriting that could have been from the same family. Official papers that traced his lineage back to Harold's parents. Everything looked authentic. Everything felt right, and I wanted so desperately for it to be true that I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. Over the next few weeks, David became a regular visitor, stopping by every few days to check on me, to share stories about his life, to ask about Harold and our marriage and the family history he'd never known. He was everything I could have wanted in a nephew. Attentive without being intrusive, respectful of my independence, while showing genuine concern for my well-being. He told me about his job as a freelance consultant, which explained why his schedule was so flexible. He talked about his travels, his search for family connections, his dreams of settling down somewhere with roots in history. When he spoke about feeling disconnected from family, about growing up without knowing his father's side of the family tree, I saw my own loneliness reflected in his eyes. David had this way of making me feel important again, like my memories and stories mattered to someone. He'd ask about Harold's war service, about how we'd met, about the early days of our marriage when we were young and full of hope. He listened to my tales of the neighborhood 40 years ago, when children played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. But more than just being a good listener, David made me feel useful. He'd ask my advice about everything from investments to relationships, treating my decades of life experience like valuable wisdom rather than outdated rambling. When he mentioned that he was thinking about buying property in the area, wanting to put down roots near his newfound family, I felt a pride and joy I hadn't experienced since Harold's death. It was during his fourth visit that David casually mentioned my will, wondering if I'd made arrangements for what would happen to Harold's things, to the house, to all the memories contained within these walls. His concern seemed natural. After all, I was 79 years old with no known family, and estate planning was the responsible thing to discuss. "I hate to bring up such morbid subjects, Aunt Betty," he said, using the nickname that made my heart sing every time I heard it, "but I worry about what would happen to all of Uncle Harold's history, all your shared memories. If something happened to you, it would be such a tragedy for all of this family legacy to end up with strangers." The way he said it, with such genuine emotion in his voice, made me realize how much I'd been worrying about the same thing. The house was full of photographs, letters, Harold's military decorations, furniture that had been in his family for generations. The thought of all of it ending up in an estate sale, picked over by strangers who had no understanding of its significance, had been keeping me awake at night. That's when David offered to help me update my will, to make sure everything was properly organized and legally sound. He knew a lawyer, he said, someone who specialized in estate planning for elderly people. He could arrange for the attorney to come to the house so I wouldn't have to struggle with transportation or unfamiliar offices. "I don't want anything for myself," David assured me, his eyes soft with what appeared to be genuine affection. "I just want to make sure Uncle Harold's memory is preserved, that the family legacy continues somehow, even if it's just having someone who understands the significance of these things." I was so touched by his thoughtfulness, so grateful to finally have someone who cared about what happened to Harold's memory, that I agreed immediately. The relief I felt at knowing there would be someone to carry on our story, to preserve the photographs and letters and memories that were all I had left of my life with Harold, was overwhelming. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined in my loneliness and gratitude, was that David Marshall wasn't my nephew at all. He wasn't even David Marshall. And every word he'd spoken, every document he'd shown me, every emotion he'd displayed, was part of an elaborate performance designed to separate me from everything Harold and I had built together. The lawyer he was planning to bring to my house wasn't going to protect my interests. He was going to help steal them. And the family legacy David claimed to want to preserve was actually going to fund his next performance for his next victim. But David had made one crucial mistake in his research and planning. He'd assumed that a lonely 79-year-old woman would be so desperate for family connection that she'd accept any story that gave her what she wanted to hear. What he didn't know was that Betty Whitmore had learned a few things about deception and survival during her 79 years on this earth. And I was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget, assuming he lived long enough to remember it. The most shocking discovery was yet to come. It was Harold who first made me suspicious, or rather it was something Harold had told me years ago that didn't match with David's story. My husband had been meticulous about family history, spending countless hours in his later years organizing photographs and documents, creating a detailed family tree that he'd hoped to pass down to children we never had. Harold had talked often about his brother Thomas, and not with the fondness you'd expect for someone who died a war hero. Thomas had been the black sheep of the Whitmore family, irresponsible, unreliable, and according to Harold, completely incapable of maintaining a relationship with any woman long enough to father children. Tommy was a charmer. Harold used to say when he was in a mood to share family story, "But charm doesn't make you a good man." That boy couldn't keep a job, a promise, or a girlfriend for more than a few months at a time. Mama used to worry herself sick about what would become of him. More importantly, Harold had maintained correspondence with the military family's office for years after Thomas's death, trying to track down any personal effects or unpaid benefits. The official records had been very clear. Thomas Whitmore died unmarried and childless, with no known romantic attachments serious enough to result in pregnancy. As I sat in my kitchen the morning after David's latest visit, sipping coffee and thinking about the inconsistencies in his story, I realized I needed to do some investigating of my own. At 79, I might not be as quick as I used to be, but I still knew how to ask the right questions and where to find the right answers. My first stop was the Riverside Public Library, where Mrs. Patterson had been the head librarian for 30 years and knew how to find information that most people thought was lost forever. I told her I was researching family genealogy, which was true enough, and asked for help accessing military records and census data. What we found was disturbing. The official records confirmed what Harold had always believed. Thomas Whitmore had died single and childless. But more than that, the timeline David had given me didn't match the documented facts. According to his story, His father had been born in 1943, which would have made Thomas only 17 when he supposedly fathered a child, and still in high school when he shipped out to Vietnam. But Thomas had actually enlisted in 1963 and died in 1964, which meant David's entire timeline was off by several years. Either David had his facts wrong about his own family history, or he was lying about being Thomas's grandson altogether. I spent the next week doing more research, calling the Veterans Administration, checking with the local historical society, even contacting the high school Thomas had attended to see if they had any records of him having a serious girlfriend. Every source told the same story. Thomas Whitmore had been a loner who died young and left no descendants. But what really made my blood run cold was what I discovered when I started researching David Marshall himself. Using the library's computer, with considerable help from Mrs. Patterson's teenage grandson, I found no record of anyone by that name matching David's age and description. No social media profiles, no business registrations, no property records. For someone who claimed to work as a freelance consultant, David Marshall had remarkably little digital footprint. That's when I decided to set a small trap, something that would test whether David really knew the family history he claimed to have inherited. During his next visit, I casually mentioned a story about Harold's childhood, a completely fictional tale about him having a pet dog named Rusty that he'd supposedly talked about often. "Oh yes," David said without missing a beat. "Dad used to tell me stories about Uncle Harold and old Rusty. What a character that dog must have been." But Harold had been terrified of dogs his entire life. The result of being bitten by a neighbor's German shepherd when he was 5 years old. He would never have owned a dog, would never have talked fondly about any dog, and certainly wouldn't have passed down happy stories about a pet he never had. That's when I knew for certain that David Marshall was lying about everything. The question was why, and more importantly, what he was planning to do with the trust and access I'd given him. I started paying closer attention to David's questions and suggestions, and I began to see a pattern that chilled me to the bone. He was always steering conversations toward my finances, my property, my plans for the future. He'd ask casual questions about my bank accounts, my investments, whether I had safety deposit boxes or hidden valuables. He was also gradually isolating me from my few remaining social connections. When Mrs. Patterson called to invite me to the library's autumn book sale, David suggested that I was getting too frail for such outings. When my neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez offered to drive me to my doctor's appointment, David insisted that he should be the one taking care of such important matters. Slowly but surely, David was positioning himself as my primary caretaker and closest confidant, the person everyone would turn to if questions arose about my well-being or decision-making capacity. It was a subtle form of control, but it was control nonetheless. The breakthrough came when I decided to hire a private investigator, using money from a savings account David didn't know about. I told Mrs. Patterson I was planning a surprise for my nephew and needed help tracking down some information about his family history. It wasn't exactly a lie. I was definitely planning a surprise for David. The investigator, a competent woman named Sarah Martinez, took only 3 days to uncover the truth. David Marshall was actually David Michael Roberts, and he had a criminal history that stretched back 15 years. Fraud, elder abuse, identity theft, and in 2 cases, suspicious circumstances surrounding the deaths of elderly people who'd changed their wills to benefit him shortly before dying. The photographs and documents he'd shown me weren't family heirlooms. They were props, carefully chosen and sometimes doctored to support whatever family connection story he was selling to his current target. The watch that looked like Harold's had probably belonged to another victim, and the letters were either forged or stolen from some other family's archives. But the most terrifying discovery was that I wasn't David's first aunt in Riverside. 6 months before appearing at my door, he'd befriended an 82-year-old woman named Margaret Powell, convincing her that he was her late husband's nephew from California. Margaret had died of a heart attack just 2 weeks after signing a new will that left her entire estate to David, and the local authorities had never questioned the convenient timing. According to the investigator's report, David's method was always the same. Research elderly people living alone, usually widows with substantial assets and limited family connections. Create a plausible family relationship supported by carefully crafted documentation. Gain their trust over a period of months, gradually becoming their primary source of social contact and emotional support. Convince them to update their wills in his favor, then either wait for natural death Or, if the victim became suspicious or resistant, accelerate the timeline through methods that would appear to be natural causes. Margaret Powell's death had been ruled natural, but the investigator had found several other cases in different states where David's relatives had died under similar circumstances. Heart attacks that could have been induced by drugs, falls that could have been staged, sudden illnesses that struck otherwise healthy elderly people shortly after they'd made David their heir. I was looking at the profile of a serial killer who specialized in elderly victims, and I'd invited him into my home, my life, my heart. Worse yet, I'd been planning to make him my heir, to give him everything Harold and I had worked for during our 52 years of marriage. But David Roberts had made one crucial mistake in choosing me as his target. He'd assumed that loneliness and old age had made me weak and gullible. What he didn't know was that Betty Whitmore had been fighting battles her entire life, and I wasn't about to lose the last one to a predator who thought my gray hair meant I was helpless. The war David had started by targeting me was about to become a war he couldn't win, because this elderly widow had a few surprises of her own, and I was ready to show him exactly what kind of inheritance hunters deserve when they come for the wrong prey. But first, I had to survive long enough to spring the trap I was planning, and that meant convincing David that his manipulation was working perfectly, even while I prepared to destroy him completely. The real battle was just beginning. The hardest part about fighting a predator is pretending to be the prey while you're actually hunting the hunter. For the next month, I had to play the role of the trusting elderly aunt, while secretly gathering evidence and preparing the trap that would end David's killing spree permanently. Every time he visited, every conversation we had, every document he showed me, I had to respond with the grateful innocence he expected, while actually cataloging his methods for the authorities. It was exhausting, terrifying, and infuriating, all at the same time, but it was also the only way to make sure David Roberts would never hurt another elderly person. I started by installing a security system that David didn't know about, hidden cameras and recording devices that would capture everything he did and said in my house. The company that installed it thought I was just a paranoid old woman worried about break-ins, but I made sure they understood that discretion was essential for my peace of mind. The evidence Sarah Martinez had gathered was damning, but I knew it might not be enough to convict David of murder. His previous kills had been too subtle, too carefully designed to look like natural deaths. What I needed was proof of his current intentions, documentation of his plans for me that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. That meant I had to let David think his manipulation was working perfectly. When he suggested I should consolidate my bank accounts for easier management, I agreed enthusiastically. When he offered to help me organize my important papers, I welcomed his assistance with touching gratitude. When he mentioned that his lawyer friend was available to help update my will, I told him how relieved I was to have someone so caring looking out for my interests. But while I was playing the grateful victim, I was actually setting up David for the exposure that would destroy him. Every suggestion he made was recorded. Every document he showed me was photographed. Every promise he made was documented with dates and details that would show the systematic nature of his fraud. The lawyer David brought to my house was exactly what I'd expected. A sleazy man who specialized in helping predators steal from elderly victims. Gerald Hutchinson looked legitimate enough on the surface, with expensive suits and official-looking documents, but I could see the calculation in his eyes as he sized up my house and estimated its value. "Mrs. Whitmore," Hutchinson said, as he spread papers across my dining room table, "David has explained your situation, and I think we can create an estate plan that will give you peace of mind while ensuring your family legacy continues through your nephew." The will they presented to me was a masterpiece of legal theft disguised as family care. It left everything to David: the house, my savings, Harold's pension, even my personal belongings, while making it appear that I was a grateful elderly woman providing for the only family member who cared about me. But the document also included provisions that would give David immediate control over my finances and medical care. If I became incapacitated, which I realized meant David would have the legal authority to make decisions about my treatment if I became inconveniently suspicious or resistant to his plans. "This is so generous," I said, letting my voice quaver with emotion as I reviewed the papers. "I never expected to have family again, and now I can make sure David is taken care of the way he's taken care of me." I could see the satisfaction in both men's eyes as I played the role of the grateful victim perfectly. They thought they'd successfully manipulated another lonely old woman into signing her life away, that I was too emotionally invested in the fantasy of having family to see through their obvious deception. But while they were congratulating themselves on their clever manipulation, I was actually gathering evidence that would send them both to prison for the rest of their lives. Every word of our conversation was being recorded. Every document was being photographed. And my private investigator was building a case that connected David to at least 6 suspicious deaths across 3 states. The signing was scheduled for the following week, which meant I had 7 days to complete my preparations and spring the trap that would end David's career as an inheritance hunter. But first, I had to make sure he didn't suspect that his cover had been blown. That meant continuing to play the lonely widow who was pathetically grateful for his attention. When David suggested I should probably avoid discussing our family connection with neighbors, some people might not understand how wonderful it is that we found each other, I agreed that it should be our special secret. When he offered to help me with grocery shopping and errands, making me increasingly dependent on his assistance, I thanked him for his thoughtfulness. But I also started subtly testing David's knowledge and reactions, setting small traps that would reveal more about his methods and intentions. I mentioned that I'd been having chest pains and shortness of breath, watching his face carefully for signs of satisfaction or anticipation. Sure enough, his eyes lit up with what he probably thought was concern but actually looked more like hope. "Maybe you should see a doctor," he suggested, but his tone indicated he hoped I wouldn't. "Although at your age these things are often just natural signs of aging. The important thing is that you're not alone. I'll be here to take care of everything if anything happens." The way he said, "take care of everything," made my skin crawl, because I knew exactly what he meant. If I died of natural causes before the will signing, David would still inherit nothing. But if I died after signing the will, especially if it appeared to be from the heart problems I'd mentioned, David would become a very wealthy young man. I also started asking casual questions about his other elderly relatives, watching for his reactions when I mentioned names I'd found in Sarah Martinez's investigation. When I asked if he'd ever had any aunts or uncles besides me, David claimed he'd been completely alone in the world until finding me. But when I casually mentioned that I'd heard about a Margaret Powell who'd died recently, such a shame when alerting people pass away with no family to remember them, David's reaction was immediate and telling. His face went pale, his hands tightened on his coffee cup, and for just a moment I saw fear flicker in his eyes. "I'm sorry to hear about anyone's passing," he said carefully, "but I don't think I knew anyone by that name." The lie was so obvious, so poorly delivered, that it confirmed everything I'd suspected. David had killed Margaret Portwold, probably along with the other victims Sarah had identified, and he was planning to kill me as soon as I signed the will that would make him my heir. But David Roberts had made the fatal mistake of underestimating his intended victim. This 79-year-old widow wasn't the helpless prey he'd been hunting for years. I was an apex predator who'd been hiding in plain sight, and I was about to show him what happened when inheritance hunters pick the wrong target. The will signing was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. By Thursday evening, David's hunting days would be permanently ended, one way or another. The only question was whether he'd live long enough to face justice in a courtroom, or whether the trap I was setting would solve the problem more permanently. Either way, Margaret Powell and all the other elderly victims David had murdered would finally have their revenge, and David Roberts would learn that some prey bite back harder than predators ever expect. What I had planned for him was more poetic than anything the legal system could provide. Thursday arrived gray and cold, with the kind of bitter November wind that rattled windows and made old houses creak with mysterious sounds. It seemed appropriate weather for what I had planned, the kind of day when anything could happen, and no one would be surprised by sudden tragedy. David arrived exactly on time, carrying his briefcase and wearing his most trustworthy smile. He dressed carefully for the occasion, expensive suit, conservative tie, the kind of outfit that would help him look like a grieving but responsible heir when he had to explain my sudden death to the authorities. Gerald Hutchinson arrived 15 minutes later, and I watched from my window as the 2 men talked briefly on my front porch before coming to the door. There was something different about their body language today, a confidence and anticipation that told me they were ready to move from the preparation phase to the execution phase of their plan. "Good afternoon, Aunt Betty," David said, leaning down to kiss my cheek with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Are you ready for this big day? I know Uncle Harold would be so proud to see his family legacy being preserved." The casual mention of Harold, the man whose memory David was dishonoring with every breath he took, made me want to slap him across his handsome lying face. But I maintained my role, smiling with grateful tears in my eyes, as I welcomed my beloved nephew and his helpful lawyer friend into my home. We settled in the dining room, where Hutchinson spread the legal documents across the polished mahogany table Harold and I had bought for our first wedding anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on me. These predators were using our most treasured piece of furniture as a platform for stealing everything we'd built together. "Mrs. Whitmore," Hutchinson said in his smooth, professional voice, "I've prepared everything exactly as you and David discussed. This will ensure that your estate passes smoothly to your nephew, while minimizing any tax implications or legal complications." I reviewed the papers with the careful attention of someone who understood their importance, asking questions that made me sound thorough but not suspicious. The will was even more comprehensive than I'd expected, not only leaving David everything I owned, but also containing detailed instructions about my funeral, my burial, and the disposal of my personal belongings. Reading between the lines, I could see that David had planned for every contingency. If I died of natural causes, the will would ensure a smooth transfer of assets. If anyone questioned the circumstances of my death, the document would serve as evidence that I'd been of sound mind and had made my wishes clear while healthy and competent. But what truly chilled me was a clause buried in the legal language that gave David immediate authority to make medical decisions on my behalf if I became incapacitated. Combined with the powers of attorney he'd included in the package, this meant David would have complete control over my care if I became inconveniently ill or suspicious of his motives. "This is perfect," I said, letting emotion make my voice unsteady as I reached for the pen Hutchinson offered. "I never expected to feel such peace about the future. David, you've given me the greatest gift an old woman could ask for. The knowledge that Harold's memory will live on through family." I could see both men relax as I spoke, probably thinking they'd successfully manipulated another elderly victim into signing her death warrant. David's smile became more genuine. Hutchinson's posture became less tense, and both of them began to show signs of the satisfaction that comes with a successful hunt. That's when I decided it was time to reveal that the roles in this drama weren't quite what they'd assumed. "But before I sign this," I said, setting down the pen and looking directly at David, "I'd like to ask you a few questions about our family history, just to make sure I have all the details right for posterity." Something flickered in David's eyes. Caution, maybe, or the first hint that this conversation wasn't going according to his script. "Of course, Aunt Betty. What would you like to know?" "Well, I was thinking about your grandfather Thomas and his relationship with Harold. You mentioned they were close, but that's not quite how Harold remembered it. In fact, Harold used to say that Thomas was irresponsible and unreliable, completely incapable of maintaining a relationship long enough to father children." The silence that followed was deafening. David's confident smile faltered, and I could see him calculating how to explain away this inconsistency in his story. "Family relationships can be complicated," he said carefully. "Maybe Uncle Harold didn't know about all of Thomas's relationships."
Maybe,
I agreed. "Or maybe Thomas Whitmore died young and childless, exactly like the official military records say he did. Maybe there never was a grandson searching for his father's family. Maybe David Marshall doesn't exist at all." The transformation in David's face was immediate and terrifying. The mask of family affection dropped completely, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. Hutchinson's hand moved toward his briefcase, probably reaching for whatever weapon they'd brought to handle complications like this one. But I was ready for them. Hidden throughout the house were recording devices that had been capturing every word of our conversation. More importantly, at that very moment, Sheriff Peterson was positioned just outside my back door, waiting for the signal we'd arranged. "Hello, David Michael Roberts," I said, using his real name for the first time. "I've been expecting you to show your true face eventually." The shock in his eyes was satisfying, but what I saw underneath the shock was even more revealing: rage, calculation, and a kind of desperate fury that told me exactly how dangerous this man really was when his careful plans went wrong. "You stupid old bitch," he snarled, abandoning any pretense of civility. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've stopped a killer," I replied, feeling calmer and more in control than I had in months. "I've made sure Margaret Powell and all your other victims finally get justice, and I've proven that some elderly widows are a lot more dangerous than inheritance hunters expect." That's when David made his final, fatal mistake. Instead of trying to talk his way out of the situation or attempting to flee, He let his rage override his survival instincts. He lunged toward me across the dining room table, probably intending to silence me before I could expose him further. But I'd been ready for this moment, had been preparing for it since the day I discovered his real identity. As David reached for me with murderous intent, I triggered the signal device hidden in my pocket, and Sheriff Peterson burst through the back door with his weapon drawn and ready. "Freeze! Police!" Peterson shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "David Roberts, you're under arrest for fraud, elder abuse, and suspicion of murder." But David wasn't finished. In his desperation, he tried to grab me as a hostage, probably thinking he could negotiate his way out of the trap that had snapped shut around him. What he didn't expect was that this 79-year-old woman had learned a few things about self-defense during her 8 decades on Earth. The heavy crystal paperweight that Harold had kept on his desk made a satisfying thud when it connected with David's temple. As he crumpled to the floor of my dining room, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced since Harold's death. "Margaret Powell sends her regards," I told his unconscious form as Sheriff Peterson cuffed him. "On with all the other elderly people you murdered for their money." As the authorities took David and Hutchinson away, I stood in my dining room, looking at the unsigned will that would never steal Harold's legacy. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The fierce satisfaction of a battle won against impossible odds. But the most rewarding part was still to come. Seeing justice finally served for all the elderly victims who died believing they were leaving their estates to loving family members, never knowing they were actually funding their own murders. The inheritance David Roberts received was exactly what he deserved, and it would last for the rest of his natural life. The arrest of David Roberts sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across multiple states, triggering the largest elder abuse investigation in the region's history. Within hours of his capture in my dining room, detectives from 6 different jurisdictions were coordinating efforts to uncover the full scope of his crimes. The evidence I'd helped gather proved to be just the beginning. Once investigators knew what to look for, they found connections between David and suspicious deaths stretching back over 12 years. Bank records, property transfers, forged documents, and witness statements began painting a picture of systematic predation that was staggering in its scope and cold-blooded calculation. The private investigator Sarah Martinez had been conservative in her initial estimates. As the investigation deepened, authorities linked David to at least 14 suspicious deaths across 5 states, with evidence suggesting there might be additional victims whose cases had never been properly investigated. Each case followed the same basic pattern I'd experienced. David would research elderly people living alone, create a plausible family connection, spend months gaining their trust, convince them to change their wills in his favor, then either wait for natural death or accelerate the timeline through methods designed to appear accidental or medical. Margaret Powell's case became the key to understanding David's evolution as a killer. The initial investigation into her death had been perfunctory. An 82-year-old woman dying of a heart attack was hardly unusual. But when investigators looked deeper, they found evidence of digilase in her system, a heart medication that could be lethal when given to someone who didn't need it. Mr. Roberts had developed what can only be described as a systematic approach to inheritance fraud and murder. District Attorney Maria Rodriguez explained to the packed courtroom during opening statements. He identified vulnerable elderly people with substantial assets, manipulated them psychologically through fabricated family connections, then killed them for their money, while making it appear natural. The prosecution presented evidence showing how David had used multiple identities and sophisticated forgery techniques to create convincing family histories. He'd stolen photographs from obituaries and estate sales, doctored documents to support his stories, and even researched actual family genealogies to make his connections seem authentic. But perhaps the most chilling evidence was David's own record-keeping. Hidden in a storage unit, registered under one of his false identities, investigators found detailed files on over 30 potential victims, including photographs, financial information, and analysis of their psychological vulnerabilities. My file was thicker than most, containing detailed psychological analysis of my loneliness, my attachment to Harold's memory, and what David called my family connection vulnerability. He'd studied me for months before making contact, learning about my habits, my finances, and most importantly, my desperate desire for family connection. The trial lasted 6 weeks and drew national media attention as the scope of David's crimes became clear. Families of his victims testified about their loved ones' final months, describing how vibrant, independent elderly people had gradually become isolated and dependent before dying under suspicious circumstances. David's defense team tried to argue that their client was a troubled man driven to desperate measures by childhood trauma and financial pressures. They painted him as someone who'd made terrible choices but who wasn't the calculated predator the prosecution described. But the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic accountants showed how David had systematically stolen over $4 million from his victims. Medical experts testified about the sophisticated methods he'd used to induce heart attacks and other apparently natural causes of death. Digital forensic specialists traced his use of multiple identities and forged documents across more than a decade. Most damaging of all was David's own testimony. When he took the stand in his defense, he couldn't resist trying to justify his actions, to explain how he'd actually been providing a service to lonely elderly people. These were people with no real family, no meaningful connections, he said, his voice carrying the same fell sincerity I'd heard for months. I gave them purpose in their final years, made them feel loved and important. The fact that they chose to show their gratitude through their wills was just natural human generosity. The prosecutor, Ms. Rodriguez, was relentless in her cross-examination. Mr. Roberts, did Margaret Powell show her gratitude by dying of digitalis poisoning? I never harmed anyone, David replied, but his composure was cracking. If these people died, it was from natural causes associated with advanced age. Natural causes that coincidentally occurred after you'd gained control over their medications, their finances, and their social connections. I was helping them die so you could inherit their life savings. That's when David finally revealed the callous predator he'd kept hidden beneath his charming facade. You don't understand what these people's lives were like, he shouted. Sitting alone in empty houses, forgotten by everyone, waiting to die. I gave their deaths meaning, made their final years count for something. The courtroom erupted at this admission. David Roberts had just confirmed everything the prosecution had alleged, that he viewed elderly people as disposable resources, whose only value lay in what he could steal from them. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: 14 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of elder abuse, fraud, and attempted murder in my case. The judge sentenced David to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that his crimes represented a particularly heinous betrayal of trust and human dignity. But for me, the real victory wasn't in seeing David punished. It was in knowing that his killing spree had ended, that no other elderly person would fall victim to his predatory manipulation. During the sentencing phase, I was allowed to make a victim impact statement. I stood at that podium looking directly at David Roberts for what I hoped would be the last time, and spoke for all the elderly victims who would never have the chance to speak for themselves. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady and strong. This man thought he could prey on elderly people because he believed we were helpless, lonely, and desperate enough to believe any lie that promised us family connection. He was wrong. We are survivors, people who've lived through wars, depressions, and losses that would break weaker individuals. We've built families, careers, and communities through the hardest times imaginable. I looked directly at David as I continued. You saw our loneliness as weakness, our trust as stupidity, our age as vulnerability. But what you failed to understand is that survival makes us strong, not weak. Experience teaches us wisdom, not gullibility. And sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. David was led away in shackles, and I never saw him again. But his conviction had exposed a form of elder abuse that extended far beyond his individual crimes, leading to new laws requiring stricter verification of family relationships in inheritance cases and better protection for elderly people living alone. 3 years have passed since I stood in that courtroom and watched David Roberts receive his life sentence. I'm 82 years old now, and the Victorian house on Maple Street is still my home, though I've made some changes to ensure my safety and independence. The most important change isn't in my security system or emergency protocols. It's in how I see myself and how the community sees elderly people in general. The investigation and trial turned me from a potential victim into a symbol of elderly empowerment, proving that age and loneliness don't automatically make someone helpless prey. I've used the experience to establish the Harold Whitmore Foundation for Elder Protection, named for my husband, whose memory David tried to exploit. The foundation provides resources for elderly people to verify family connections, offers support for those who've been targeted by inheritance fraudsters, and trains law enforcement officers to recognize the signs of systematic elder abuse. The foundation has helped identify and prevent 12 additional cases of inheritance fraud, saving elderly victims an estimated $2.8 million in assets, and possibly saving their lives as well. Each case reinforced what I learned during my encounter with David. Predators targeting the elderly are far more common than most people realize, and they often use family connection stories as their primary weapon. I've also become a speaker on elder safety, traveling to senior centers and community groups across the region to share my story and teach people how to protect themselves from inheritance hunters. The response is always powerful. Elderly people who thought they were alone in their suspicions, family members who'd noticed concerning changes in their elderly relatives, even law enforcement officers who'd never understood how sophisticated these scams could be. The thing about predators, I always tell my audiences, is that they count on us feeling ashamed, our loneliness, desperate for connection, and grateful for any attention at all. They want us to believe that questioning their stories means we're paranoid or ungrateful. But healthy skepticism isn't paranoia, it's wisdom. I've learned that David's method of creating fake family connections is more common than anyone realized. Since the trial, I've been contacted by elderly people from across the country who've had similar experiences with charming young relatives who appeared out of nowhere with heartwarming stories and inheritance-focused agendas. The private investigator Sarah Martinez has become not just a colleague but a friend, and together we've developed a network of resources for elderly people who suspect they might be targets of inheritance fraud. We've created checklists for verifying family relationships, warning signs of manipulation, and most importantly, support systems that help elderly people maintain their independence while staying safe. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome has been the connections I've made with other elderly people who refuse to be seen as helpless victims. Through the Foundation's work, I've met remarkable individuals who've survived their own encounters with predators, and together we've created a community of mutual support and protection. Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, 78, discovered that her grandson was actually a con artist trying to steal her ranch in Texas. Mr. Robert Chen, 84, exposed a fake nephew who'd been slowly poisoning him while positioning himself as heir to a valuable art collection. Mrs. Patricia Johnson, 80, caught her supposed great-niece forging checks and attempting to transfer property deeds. Each story reinforces the same truth. Elderly people are not inherently vulnerable, and age does not automatically make someone an ED target. We have decades of experience in recognizing deception, surviving challenges, and protecting what matters to us. The predators who target us succeed only when we allow loneliness and gratitude to override our natural caution. The house where David tried to manipulate me has become a symbol of elderly independence rather than isolation. I've opened it regularly for foundation meetings, support group gatherings, and educational seminars. Visitors often comment on how vibrant and alive the space feels, how clearly this is a home where someone thrives rather than merely survives. I still miss Harold terribly. Still wish we'd been blessed with children who would have given us the family connections. David exploded in his manipulation, but I've learned that family isn't just about blood relations or legal inheritance. It's about the connections we build with people who value us for who we are, rather than what we own. The cats that the neighbors used to whisper about have multiplied, and my garden has been transformed from overgrown chaos into something that wins awards from the local horticultural society. These aren't the desperate activities of a lonely old woman. They're the passionate pursuits of someone who's discovered renewed purpose in her golden years. Sometimes young people ask me if I'm afraid, living alone after what happened with David. I tell them that fear is different from caution, and that being 82 years old doesn't mean being helpless. I've learned to trust my instincts, to ask hard questions when something doesn't feel right, and to remember that real family relationships develop naturally over time, rather than appearing fully formed with legal documents. I also tell them about the unexpected strength I discovered during those months, when I thought I was being manipulated. The lonely 79-year-old widow who let David into her home learned that she was capable of investigation, strategic planning, and courage she never knew she possessed. That knowledge has made every day since feel like an opportunity to use my experience and wisdom for purposes that matter. Every morning when I wake up in the house where David planned my death, I'm reminded that the best revenge against predators is a life well lived, a purpose well served, and a legacy that protects others from the darkness you've survived. The elderly people who hear my story now understand that they don't have to choose between independence and safety, that their age and experience can be sources of strength rather than vulnerability. And inheritance hunters like David Roberts are learning that the generation they thought would be easy prey is actually made up of people who've survived the Great Depression, world wars, and countless personal challenges. We're tougher than we look, smarter than they assume, and far more dangerous when threatened than anyone expects. David Roberts learned that lesson too late to save himself, but maybe his failure will serve as a warning to others who think elderly people are easy marks for inheritance fraud. My name is Betty Whitmore. I'm 82 years old, and I'm still here, still fighting, still proving that sometimes the most dangerous person in any conversation is the one who looks like a harmless old woman, but has the heart of a warrior and the mind of a strategist. If you're listening to this story, and you're facing something that seems impossible, remember what a lonely widow learned when a predator came to her door disguised as family. You're stronger than your circumstances, wiser than your loneliness, and more capable than anyone, including yourself, might realize. And sometimes when monsters think they've found the perfect victim, that's exactly when ordinary people find extraordinary courage and change the world in ways that protect generations of future victims. The predators of this world are counting on you to stay grateful, to stay trusting, to believe you're powerless. Prove them wrong.